Every journey begins in the ordinary world, and for Japan, that world was one of isolation and tradition. For over 2 centuries, Japan shut its doors to the outside world, adhering to strict isolationist policies under the rule of the shogunate, the military dictators who controlled the country in the name of the emperor. From the early 1600s until the mid-1800s, Japan had little contact with other nations. Foreigners were restricted to a small island near Nagasaki, and no Japanese citizens were allowed to leave the country under threat of execution. During this period, Japan existed in a pre-modern state, largely oblivious to the rapid advancements in industry, science, and military technology that were taking place across Europe and the West. In 1853, this insular world was shattered by Commodore Matthew Perry of the US Navy, who sailed into Tokyo Bay with the most American-like foreign policy ultimatum: open your ports to international trade or we will force them open. The sight of American warships, symbols of Western power and industrial might off their coast, left the Japanese leadership in shock. Japan's leaders realized they had fallen far behind the West in terms of industrialization and military capabilities. This was Japan's call to action, a moment that would forever alter the course of the nation's history. To be fair to the Japanese, they responded to this call with remarkable speed. The country embarked on a rapid modernization campaign during the Meiji Restoration, 1868 to 1912, which saw the end of the shogunate and the restoration of executive power to the emperor. By the late 19th century, Japan had undergone an extraordinary transformation. It had built railways, factories, and modern infrastructure, and it had established a powerful modern army and navy that could rival those of the Western powers. Japan's modernization was driven by a deep-seated fear of suffering the same fate as China, which had been humiliated and carved up into spheres of influence by European powers throughout the 19th century. Following the Opium Wars with Britain, China had been forced to sign a series of unequal treaties that granted foreign powers control over key territories and trade. Cities like Shanghai and Hong Kong became foreign enclaves, where European laws reigned supreme, and Chinese sovereignty was reduced to a shadow. The Chinese government had lost control over its own economy and military, making it a virtual puppet state under Western dominance. Witnessing this disintegration, Japan was determined to avoid becoming another victim of imperialism, pushing them toward rapid modernization and military expansion to safeguard their independence. The other was to establish itself as a global power. Japan believed that to gain respect from Western nations, it had to prove its strength on the battlefield. This belief was confirmed in 1896 when Japan defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War, marking Japan's emergence as a regional power. Japan then shocked the world by defeating Russia. Yes, Russia. Not many can say that, in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. The first time in modern history that an Asian nation had defeated a European power. Japan had done an excellent job of training and preparing its military, and this was the showcase battle. However, despite these triumphs, many Japanese felt that the Western powers still did not treat them as equals. The Treaty of Portsmouth, which ended the Russo-Japanese War, left many in Japan feeling shortchanged in their territorial gains. Partner this with some traditional racial bias, and you can see why the Japanese felt frustrated. This growing frustration would soon give rise to a more aggressive form of nationalism, setting Japan on a collision course with its neighbors. By the early 20th century, Japan had become increasingly militaristic. There was a widespread belief among the Japanese military and political elite that Japan needed to expand its empire to secure resources and land, as well as to gain the respect they believed they were due. But this drive for expansion was not purely strategic, it was also ideological. Japan, much like other extreme regimes, embraced an ideology of racial superiority. The Japanese military hierarchy and the government indoctrinated their people with the belief that the Japanese race was superior to all others, particularly the Chinese. This ideology justified Japan's brutal imperialism and its horrific treatment of the people it conquered. A twisted version of the Bushido Code, originally a samurai code of ethics emphasizing honor, duty, and courage, was adopted by Japan's military to encourage fanatical loyalty to the emperor and utter contempt for non-Japanese people. The traditional Bushido Code valued self-discipline and respect, but under this new interpretation, it was distorted to glorify death in battle and justify brutal atrocities. fostering an atmosphere where cruelty against foreign populations was not only tolerated, but actively encouraged. This creed was famously used to indoctrinate the kamikaze pilots into their suicide missions, in the name of the emperor. It could be argued that Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and its subsequent invasion of China in 1937 marked the beginning of World War II. In the areas they occupied, the Japanese military showed little regard for human life. The most infamous example of this brutality was the rape of Nanjing in 1937, where Japanese troops murdered, raped, and tortured hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians in an orgy of violence. We will have to save the details on this one for a future video. While the horrors of Nanjing were fairly publicized, there was another, even more terrifying chapter unfolding in Manchuria, one that remained hidden from the world for decades. This was the story of Unit 731, a facility where the line between science and sadism vanished entirely. Shiro Ishii, a Japanese army physician and microbiologist, was a rising star in the Japanese military and became obsessed with the potential of biological and chemical warfare. After studying the devastating effects of chemical weapons during World War I, Ishii saw immense strategic value in using disease as a weapon of war. He believed that Japan could gain an incredible military advantage by developing biological weapons capable of devastating enemy populations. Armed with these ambitions, Ishii spent years lobbying Japan's military leadership, eventually convincing them to provide him with unlimited resources to pursue his research. This ambition culminated in the establishment of Unit 731, a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit disguised as a water purification unit. Located near the city of Harbin in Manchuria, Unit 731 became a macabre facility, where human experimentation was conducted on a massive scale from 1936 to 1945. The victims of these experiments were primarily Chinese civilians, but Korean prisoners, Russian POWs, and even some Westerners were subjected to Ishii's horrific trials. Japan has long suppressed the full extent of the atrocities committed at Unit 731, but it is believed that up to 300,000 people died as a result of these barbaric experiments, which remain some of the most horrific war crimes in history. The victims of Unit 731 were treated as logs, a dehumanizing term used by the Japanese scientists to refer to their test subjects. These logs were subjected to unimaginable horrors, all in the name of scientific research, of course. The prisoners were to act as human guinea pigs, used in experiments designed to perfect biological and chemical warfare methods. The biological experiments conducted at Unit 731 were among the most gruesome and inhumane ever recorded. Shiro Ishii and his team of scientists believed that disease could be weaponized to wipe out entire enemy populations without direct military engagement. To this end, they infected prisoners with deadly pathogens, such as bubonic plague, cholera, typhus, anthrax, and smallpox, deliberately exposing them to observe how quickly the diseases spread, how they affected the human body, and how they could be weaponized on a larger scale. Infected individuals were monitored to document the stages of infection, as they deteriorated from high fevers, extreme pain, vomiting, and severe organ failure. These prisoners were vivisected, dissected alive, so scientists could observe the progression of the diseases in real time. Their organs and tissues were removed without anesthesia to study how the diseases attacked the body. Perhaps even more horrifying was Ishii's development of flea bombs, designed to spread bubonic plague on a large scale. Infected fleas were bred in the facility and then released into Chinese villages surrounding the Harbin area. These flea bombs would cause outbreaks of plague and typhoid, wiping out entire communities. Victims had no idea what had hit them, and the resulting epidemics were left unchecked, leading to massive civilian death tolls. Another experiment involved contaminating water sources with cholera and typhoid, where nearby villages were used as testing grounds to see how quickly populations could be incapacitated. Thousands of civilians unknowingly consumed tainted water, spreading disease rapidly. These chilling experiments were not limited to the laboratory. Field tests were carried out on live populations, using biological agents like plague fleas, infecting clothing, and contaminated food supplies, to simulate how biological weapons could be deployed in wartime. The military application of these experiments was clear. to use disease as a silent, invisible killer, capable of decimating civilian populations and military forces alike without ever firing a shot. At Unit 731, freezing experiments were designed to study the effects of extreme cold on the human body, primarily to develop survival strategies for Japanese soldiers fighting in harsh winter conditions. Prisoners were forced to stand outside in sub-zero temperatures, sometimes with their arms or legs submerged in icy water until their limbs froze solid. The Japanese scientists meticulously observed the stages of frostbite, noting how skin and muscle tissues deteriorated, turned black, and eventually died. After the limbs were frozen, they were thawed by dousing them with hot water or exposing them to heat, allowing scientists to observe the onset of gangrene. In many cases, the limbs were then amputated to study secondary infections, while some prisoners had their limbs refrozen multiple times to document the body's response to repeated frostbite injuries. Female prisoners were subjected to rape and forced pregnancy to study the transmission of sexually transmitted diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea. Often male prisoners infected with these diseases were forced to rape female prisoners, and the pregnancies that resulted were used to observe the effects of disease on childbirth. Many of these women were then also vivisected, their bodies used to further study the progression of infection. Other prisoners were exposed to chemical weapons, such as mustard gas and phosgene, to study the effects of these weapons on the human body. Radiation experiments were also conducted, where prisoners were subjected to high levels of radiation to study the resulting burns, cancer, and internal damage. Some prisoners were burned alive, while others were subjected to chemical burns as part of the research. As Japan's empire began to crumble in 1945, Shiro Ishii and his staff at Unit 731 scrambled to destroy evidence of their crimes. Laboratories were set ablaze, records were burned, and remaining prisoners were executed. Despite these efforts, some evidence survived, and eyewitness accounts from former prisoners and soldiers began to surface after the war. However, the most damning evidence, the data from Unit 731's biological and chemical experiments, was safely in the hands of Shiro Ishii and his team. When it came to prosecuting Ishii and his associates at the end of the war, they were actually granted immunity by the United States. In exchange for their research data on biological warfare, the US chose not to prosecute them for war crimes. The US military saw value in the horrific human experiments conducted at Unit 731, and believed the data could be used in the event of future conflicts, particularly in the context of the Cold War. As a result, none of the key figures from Unit 731 were held accountable for their actions. If this isn't the most US military stance on a matter in history, I don't know what is. Shiro Ishii, the mastermind behind Unit 731, lived out the remainder of his life unpunished. He retired to Japan, where he avoided public scrutiny and died peacefully of natural causes in 1959. Other Unit 731 officers and scientists also managed to escape justice, with many returning to normal civilian life. Some even went on to hold prominent positions in Japanese medicine and academia after the war, their past atrocities largely hidden from the public. For decades, the existence of Unit 731 and its crimes remained shrouded in secrecy. Both the Japanese government and the US authorities worked to suppress information about the atrocities committed there. Japan, having surrendered to the United States, was rebuilt with American assistance, and there was little incentive for either country to expose the darker aspects of Japan's wartime conduct. The US government, in particular, was keen to prevent details of its deal with Ishii from becoming public, as it would have raised serious questions about the ethical implications of allowing war criminals to escape justice in exchange for scientific data. As a result, for many years, the story of Unit 731 was largely absent from the public consciousness. In Japan, the war crimes of Unit 731 were barely acknowledged, and discussions of the atrocities were suppressed in history textbooks and official narratives. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that significant efforts were made to bring the truth about Unit 731 to light. Former employees of the unit, now elderly, began to come forward with their stories, and historians slowly uncovered documents that had been hidden for decades. Survivors of the experiments and their descendants, particularly in China, also began to speak out, demanding recognition of the atrocities committed against their people. Despite these efforts, the Japanese government has yet to fully acknowledge the extent of the crimes committed at Unit 731. While some public apologies have been issued over the years, they have often been vague or insufficient, and the full story of Unit 731 is still not widely taught in Japanese schools. Memorials to the victims of Unit 731 exist in China, but within Japan itself, the memory of these atrocities remains contested and obscured. Now, you wouldn't blame the Japanese government for them not wanting this information to be public, but some level of accountability must be shown. Hopefully they don't come after me, or else you won't be able to see all the exciting videos we have coming up on No Filter History. I hope you enjoyed this video uncovering a nation's dark past. Until next time, peace out.